Welcome to Team Paya-Math, kung saan tuturuan ko kayong pagyamanin pa ang inyong mga nalalaman tungkol sa math. But before we go to our topic for today, don't forget to click the notification bell and subscribe button para updated ka sa mga videos ko. So our topic for today is about sequences. This is the first topic in the first quarter of grade 10 mathematics. So now, what are our objectives for this discussion? These are the most essential learning competencies. We have the first one, which is to define sequence. Next, illustrate sequence. And then the third one, you must generate patterns.
So now, what is a sequence, or how do we define a sequence? A sequence is a succession of numbers in a specific order, meaning it follows a certain pattern or order, and each number in a sequence is called a term. The terms are formed according to some fixed rule or property. Kagaya nga ng sabi ko, it should follow a specific pattern or specific order. They are arranged as the first term, second term, third term, and up to the nth term or the last term of that sequence. Now, we do not have a zero term, okay? So you need to take note of that. We only have the first term, or the sequence will start at the first term, and so on. So kagaya nga ng description ng sequence sa taas, the sequence starts with the first term, second term, third term, and so on. Meaning, minsan may mga sequence na hindi natin alam, pero may mga sequence naman na definite lang yung number of terms nila. So that's why we have two kinds of sequences. The first one is what we call the finite sequence. A sequence with definite number of terms is called a finite sequence. In a finite sequence, the first and the last term are clearly identified. Meaning, alam na alam mo kung ano yung value, ano yung nasa first term, at ano yung nasa last term ng sequence na yon. Examples. So we have the following, which are examples of sequences that are finite. So if you're going to take a look at the table that we have in here, on the first column of our table, we have the examples or the sequences. And then on the second column of the table, we have the first term. And then on the third column, we have the last term. And on the last column or the fourth column, we have the number of terms. So if you're going to consider the first example of a finite sequence, we have the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in this sequence, we can clearly identify the first term, which is 1, and then the last term, which is 5. And then if you're going to count how many terms are there in the sequence, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's why we have here 5 terms. And then on the second example of our sequence, we have -2, 4, -8, up to -2048. And then we have the last term, which is 4096. Again, clearly defined yung first term at saka yung last term natin. Our first term here is -2, and our last term is 4096. If you're going to count, okay, so here's the challenge now for us. If you're going to count the number of terms, okay, for this sequence, so saan ba siya nag-start? Nag-start siya with -2, followed by 4, followed by -8. What do you think is the next number after -8? It should be +16. Okay? And as we all know, 2048 is actually 2 raised to 11 times -1. So from -2 to -2048, we already have 11 terms. Plus that our last term, which is 4096, which is equivalent to 2 raised to 12. Our number of terms now is 12. Okay? And then on the last sequence that we have 38, 33, 28, 23, 18, and then 13. So this one is different from the other two. The first one, we have, as you can see, the terms here are all positive. On the second sequence that we have, the terms here are alternating. We have alternating signs. We have negative, positive, negative. But in this, even though we have a sequence with positive terms, But if you're going to take a look at the tendency of the sequence, it tends to decrease. So this one is decreasing. Okay? But again, this is an example of finite sequence. Why? Because the first term and the last term are clearly defined. So our first term here is 38, as you can see, and then the last term is 13. And then we can actually count the number of terms in here, unlike dun sa kanina, sa example number 2 natin. So here we only have 6 terms. So these are the example of a finite sequences. But how about infinite sequences? So a sequence with no definite number of terms is called an infinite sequence, which is the opposite of the finite sequence. Kung sa finite sequence, clearly define yung first and last term natin, dito, hindi natin madedetermine kung ano yung last term ng sequence kasi nga it tends to go to infinity. So we also have different examples of infinite sequence. So we consider this, okay, sequences as our examples for infinite sequence. So what do you think is common with these sequences? And how do we recognize whether a sequence is an infinite or a finite sequence other than the first term and then the last term? As you can see with the first, okay, for the first 3 examples that we have, the first terms are clearly defined. So for this sequence, the first term is -9. For the second sequence, the first term is 27. And then for the third sequence, we have 1/2. But when you take a look at their last term, it is being represented by the ellipsis. Okay? The ellipsis, as we all know, represents the continuation of a certain, in this case, the sequence. Okay? Meaning we do not know the last term of these sequences. Okay? So these ellipses are actually our another way to recognize whether the sequence is an infinite or not. But when you take a look at the example number 4, where is the position of the ellipses? It is on the leftmost part, no? In this case naman, okay, the last term is clearly defined. So, hindi sa lahat ng pagkakataon first term yung given, no? Tapos ellipsis yung nasa dulo. In this case, pwedeng ang given ay yung last term. Here, the last term is -16. Okay? But we do not know the first term. Ang alam lang natin itong last 5 terms ng sequence. So, with the first term, the other terms, hindi natin alam because they are being represented by this ellipsis. Meaning, the sequence is infinite. When you take a look at our previous example, this one, okay, in finite sequence, to be exact, example number 2, here we use ellipses, but the position of the ellipses is between 2 defined terms, okay? So even though we use ellipses here, okay, dahil meron naman tayong defined, may definite tayong terms, okay, na pinagigitaan yung ellipsis na yon. At alam na natin yung first term and last term na to, this one, this sequence, it's still an example of a finite sequence. So, ibig sabihin, hindi sa lahat ng pagkakataon, kahit na gumamit ka ng ellipsis, ay yung sequence mo, masasabi mong infinite. Okay? Nakadepende yon sa position nung ellipsis. Pag ang ellipsis ay nasa leftmost and rightmost at wala nang susunod sa kanila na terms, that means that sequence is an infinite sequence. Okay?